class, we're going to discuss the validity, reliability, and fairness of assessments. Before beginning the screencast, be sure that you have read the O'Malley chapter, which is under D2L for this online class. The reading will ground your thinking and help you make connections to any new learning as part of the screencast. Remember, part of the reason we're talking about this is that high-quality assessment should be valid, reliable, and fair. However, with that being said, it is good to keep in mind that there is no perfect assessment. No one assessment is completely valid, completely fair, or completely reliable. When thinking about both standardized or large-scale assessment as well as formative assessment in the classroom, we want to seek to make it as valid, reliable, and fair as possible, but also realize that we cannot do everything with just one assessment. So part of the purpose of the critique in your case study is to determine what additional data you may need to collect in our body of evidence on the student that we are studying for our case study, and as a way to think about how we might collect information on all of the students in our class. When thinking about differentiating an assessment, we want to keep fairness, reliability, and validity in mind. Any kind of support or accommodation that we provide, we want to make sure it does not alter the construct or the content being tested. This can sometimes be challenging, but with careful planning, we can reach what we would desire to find out from our students. Let's talk first about validity. You will remember from reading the O'Malley chapter that validity is when we are able to measure with the assessment tool the content that we are intending to. Some things to think about with validity in English language learners is that there may be a validity concern for the assessment if the test items, questions, or any part of the test contain unnecessary linguistic complexity that interferes with an English language learner's ability to show their content knowledge. In simpler terms, if the assessment has language that the student is not able to access or use based on their language proficiency level, at that point, we have to question whether or not we are actually measuring their content knowledge or if we are measuring their language ability. With the linguistic complexity of the assessment having the most impact on validity for English language learners, we can think of multiple language aspects that would affect that validity. Things like grammatical features, syntactic structure, sentence types, and cohesion. You should recognize some of these key phrases from the WIDA rubrics that you've become familiar with. Research has shown that the most prominent linguistic characteristics on standardized assessments that may affect the validity of the assessment for English language learners is academic vocabulary. You may find this also to be true as you are creating assessments in the classroom. So, to accurately assess knowledge within the content areas, students must comprehend what items are asking and understand the response choices. Thinking about this helps us reflect on how we may create our own assessments or how we may need to collect other bodies of evidence if a certain assessment student was given did not meet this criteria. So when we are creating assessments, some things we can think about are when we create assessments or tests using supports like charts, graphs, and other visuals. As we know from previous work in the class, these types of supports can lessen the impact of developing language and therefore help us actually measure the content that we are wanting students to learn. Also, since academic vocabulary is one of the key pieces of linguistic concern on a test, we want to carefully evaluate the vocabulary that we are using when writing test items. Although some academic and technical vocabulary must be included as it is as part of the content knowledge being tested, this would be a great place to bring in supports. Also, before we create an assessment or hand an assessment to a student, we want to think about what general academic vocabulary might also be a stumbling block. Things like functional language, compare and contrast, sequence, and paraphrasing. These are things that show up on our assessments that we create, as well as standardized assessment. We owe it to students to teach this in class before sending them off independently on an assessment. Let's look at an example that is known to all of us, TCAP. Some ways that TCAP is valid is that the test items are made and based off of state standards, the content that we teach students every day. So because it is based off of the state standards, we should be measuring with that assessment the content at a student's grade level. Another way it's valid is that there is ongoing revision happening constantly with TCAP year after year, making sure that the test items are carefully aligned to the state standards. In addition, multiple test items are there to test similar content. There isn't simply one question to test a main standard. However, some implications for ELLs or some ways that maybe it is less valid for English language learners is of course the linguistic demands in all areas. And for students at earlier levels of English learning, there may be issues with access to both the questions and the responses as well as the test items. Now let's discuss fairness. You will remember from the O'Malley reading that fairness is basically the absence of bias. There shouldn't be different test scores with different subgroups of students. There are two main considerations for fairness: the qualities of the assessment and testing conditions. When thinking about the qualities of assessment, we need to think about how an instrument may offend or unfairly penalize a group of students because of their gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, or other group-defining characteristics. This may manifest itself in an assessment in the way a question is asked or the context in which a question is asked. On a standardized assessment, this may help us know that we need to gather other bodies of evidence. Also, as we are designing our own assessments, we want to carefully consider the way and the context in which we are asking questions. The other piece of fairness is to think about testing conditions. Overall, examinees should be treated fairly during the testing process itself. Some things to specifically think about with testing conditions are the context and purpose, that it should be the same, and also with how the assessment results are being used. Some examples of this that you are familiar with from TCAP and most likely even assessments in your classroom are that students would have comparable opportunities to demonstrate their skills and abilities. Also, test takers should be given the appropriate testing conditions and equal opportunity to prepare for the test. The grading or marking of all their work should be accurate and consistent, and the way the results are reported should be accurate and fully informative as well. When thinking about fairness for English language learners, we might think about how test items may contain references to ideas or events that are unfamiliar to English learners because they have not been exposed to similar concepts in either their native culture or have not lived in the United States for a long period of time. Obviously, the scale of fairness is dependent upon many factors: how long a student has been in the United States, how long they've been exposed to the English language, and other factors as well. There is much research about standardized assessments on minority students and students of poverty. The research has shown that over time, it appears that the assessment may be unfair. Students of poverty or minority students tend to score lower than other subgroups of students. The conclusions around this are either that the assessment itself, the standardized assessment, is unfair, or that the issue lies more in the classroom instruction before the assessment, that there is a lack of support along the way. Although this research has been done on standardized assessment, it helps us think about what other bodies of evidence we may gather in the classroom on our students, thinking about how test items are asked, as well as when we design our own assessment for students in our classroom. So let's think about TCAP again. Some ways that TCAP is fair is that accommodations are allowed for students who need it. Also, there are consistent testing conditions, as well as revisions of test items, just as in the validity section. There is a whole review board for TCAP that year after year looks at questions and considers these aspects that we've discussed before. Some things to think about for English language learners on TCAP are ways that it may be less fair for English language learners, or some cultural aspects of the test items themselves, students' background knowledge or developing background knowledge about certain aspects of the test items, also testing conditions themselves. When thinking about accommodations, there are certain accommodations allowed and certain accommodations not allowed. As we've been using the WIDA rubrics and other supports as part of WIDA, you may realize that some of the accommodations that those allow may not meet the accommodation standard that is allowable at this time on TCAP. Therefore, they may not line up with what students are used to in daily instruction. In our classroom, when we are thinking about creating formative or summative assessment ourselves, we want to think about creating test items that students have been exposed to in the classroom. We need to provide them accommodations as needed, and we can use the WIDA supports and rubrics as well as the Can-Do descriptors to help us create these supports. Reliability is the last piece of creating quality assessments. Reliability is that when the assessment is given multiple times under similar conditions, there will be consistent results. When thinking about the implications for English language learners and reliability, it's easiest to discuss this through the example of TCAP once again. So first, some ways that TCAP is reliable is that there are rubrics for response items. These rubrics ensure that there are similar expectations for a needed score. In addition, the people that score the test items using the rubrics are trained. This is to ensure that there's consistency between scoring. Also, test items are scored not just by one person, but by multiple people, therefore upping the chances of reliability and getting consistent scores over time. Some implications for English language learners with TCAP are again the linguistic demands of the assessment may affect the reliability, as well as the student's linguistic expression of their ideas. For example, when a student writes a short constructive response, their linguistic expression may impact the score which they get on the rubric. Another thing to keep in mind with TCAP for all students, not just English language learners, is that because some of the test items are scored by humans, some subjectivity will always exist. So when thinking about reliability, when you create your own assessments, think about using tools like rubrics to create reliability. Work with other colleagues to score students' assessments. This would also be a great way to check in on a student who you believe may have not performed as well as they could on a standardized assessment, but you believe they do understand the content. And lastly, provide language support using WIDA supports, rubrics, and Can-Do descriptors. Now that you've considered validity, reliability, and fairness, choose one of the assessments that you have already evaluated. This could either be a summative assessment from your assessment of learning, or this could be a formative assessment. As you think about validity, reliability, and fairness, reflect on how this assessment is each one of those things and possible implications or ways that it could be better for English language learners. Be sure to cite the O'Malley rating as you critique each feature. Finally, in conclusion, remember that there is no perfect assessment. We can think about validity, reliability, and fairness as we design our own assessments. We can also reflect on the validity, reliability, and fairness of standardized assessments that students take, and then think about ways that we can collect other evidence in the classroom that students do understand the content that we are teaching them.